We're going to pick up today with where we left off on Wednesday, which was we didn't quite get done with what I intended to do, and so we've got a few verses, two stories from Luke chapter 7 to finish up. So we're looking at Luke 7, 1 through 17, the centurion's servant and the widow's son. Again, we're working through some of the miracles that Jesus performed in that first period of his ministry, the earlier ministry before the Transfiguration. So Jesus has been teaching them, and he turns and he goes into the city, goes into Capernaum, and when he comes into the city, there is a centurion, which is a Roman military officer, right? We've talked about the centurion before. A centurion was a commander over a century, and a century we think of as being a 100-year period, but in Latin it's just 100, and it can be 100 of anything. And in the case of the Roman military, the 100 was 100 soldiers, or close to it. It was actually usually closer to 70 than 100, but that was what they called it. It was nearly 100 men, or about 100 men, and so it was called a century. And so the commander over that group was called a centurion. And so the centurion is commander over 100 Roman soldiers, which means he's probably the only one in the area. You don't need more than 100 soldiers to kind of watch over a village and its surroundings. That's actually a fairly large contingent to do that. And so the centurion has this servant who's gotten sick, and the centurion's sending to Jesus. The religious leaders, or the leaders of the synagogue in Capernaum, know this centurion. They know that he's unusual for a Roman military officer in that he is gentle with the Jewish people. He has given money to help them and given materials to help them build the synagogue and maintain it. He seems to genuinely have respect for the Jewish people and their practices, their customs, and their religion. And so the religious leaders, actually, the synagogue leaders actually really like the centurion. And so they come to the centurion or they come to Jesus on the centurion's behalf to ask him to heal this man's servant that he depends on. And so Jesus agrees and goes with them, begins traveling with them. And then while he is approaching the house, when he gets fairly close to the centurion's house, the centurion sends some friends out, some people from his household or people that know him well. He sends some friends out to him to say, "Lord, don't trouble yourself, for I do not deserve to have you come under my roof." Now, the thing is that there were a lot of things that could potentially make a Jewish person unclean, ceremonially unclean, so that they couldn't practice. They couldn't go into the temple, they couldn't go into the synagogue, and there were several things that they couldn't do when they were unclean. And so the normal thing, one of the ways that Jewish people protected themselves from becoming ritually unclean was by not going into a non-Jewish person's home. Because there were lots of things that a non-Jewish person might have in their home or might do with their home that would make a Jewish person unclean, or that would cause problems for them. Many non-Jewish people had an altar or a shrine set up somewhere in their home to whatever household or whatever gods they prayed to on a regular basis. And so they would have shrines set up, and they might burn incense on it and do all the kinds of other things, their worship, that, whatever they did to worship that idol. Or they would cook meats that Jewish people were forbidden to eat, like pig. They couldn't eat pork. And several other animals. There was a kind of a specific set of qualifications for what made an animal a clean animal, and anything else was unclean. And so if they ate something while they were there and didn't know what its source was, or what it had been cooked with, or what it had been around, then it might make them ritually unclean. And so on. There were just several things, lots of different things that might be inside of a non-Jewish person's house that could make them unclean. And so generally, Jewish people avoided going into a non-Jewish person's house. And so this centurion is respectful enough of their traditions that he sends some people out ahead to tell Jesus, don't take the trouble of coming into my house and whatever customs that might break for you, however that might make you ritually unclean, so that you can't do what you need to do for the next week. So don't come into my house. Basically, I'm not worthy of that trouble. I'm not worthy to have you come under my roof. But he says, say the word and my servant will be healed. He says, basically, if you just give the word, I trust, I know that my servant will be fine. And so he says, for I am a man under authority. I have soldiers under me. I tell this one go, and he does what I tell him. I say come, and another one come, and he comes. And if I tell my servant do this, he does it. And so the man says, I know what it's like to have authority and to be under authority, to have a commander over me and to have men under me that respond to my authority. I know that you can give the word, just as I give word to my servants and my soldiers, and they do what I ask. You can give the word, and what you ask will be done. And so just give the word. Give the word that my servant will be healed, and I know it will happen. And so Jesus stops and turns around and looks at the people following him, the leaders of the synagogue, the religious leaders of the synagogue, and the other people that had been gathering around him and following him while he was going on the way. And he tells them, he says, I tell you the truth, I tell you, I have not found such great faith even in Israel. And so Jesus seems to be overjoyed or amazed that this non-Jewish person has demonstrated a greater faith than most of the Jewish people that have been reading the scriptures and for most of their lives and should be expecting the Messiah to come. And yet this non-Jewish person, this person from totally outside the faith, has demonstrated a greater trust, a greater faith than all of those that are supposed to have been prepared by their reading of the scriptures and their traditions. And so he tells them to go on, and what they ask has happened. And when they get back, they find that the servant is indeed healed. And then soon after that, Jesus is going into another town, Nain, N-A-I-N, and his disciples are coming in, and there's a crowd coming in with him, and as they're coming in, they see a funeral procession coming out of the city, going out to bury a body. And so as he approached the town gate, a dead person was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. And a large crowd from the town was with her, and when the Lord saw her, his heart went out to her. So Jesus had compassion on this mother that had lost her only child and who was a widow, and so he had compassion on her, and he said, "Don't cry." And then he goes up and touches the bier, the pallet they're carrying the dead body on, and says, "Young man, I say to you, get up." Very reminiscent of what the phrase Jesus said when he raised the dead girl, Talitha Kum. He says, "Young man," instead of the term of endearment for a young girl. He says, "Young man, I say to you, get up." And the guy comes back to life. Now, there's something striking in this story, a couple striking things in this story. One is, if you think about what a widow is, a widow is a woman whose husband has died, right? In our culture, that's rough, right? It's rough to lose your spouse. It's very hard to lose somebody that you love that dearly, that you have built your life with, that you've been building your life around and working together to build a life and a family together. When they die, it's traumatic. It's horrible. But in the first century, for a woman in particular, this would have been much more complicated, because not only was he her husband and the one that she is building a life with, but he would have been the primary person to earn an income and to make sure that she was provided for, because women didn't typically work outside the home as much as they do now. And so a woman that had no husband, a woman whose husband had died, would have to be much more dependent on the generosity of others in order to kind of make ends meet and to survive. And this woman was a little bit better off. She was blessed because she had a son, and her son could take up some of the slack. He could work and bring home some income. Not as much as the father would, because he had, of course, years and experience and whatnot. And the young man wouldn't have been able to make as much money, but he would have been able to do some. But then he dies. And so this woman is left alone in the world. Her husband is dead. Her son is dead. Both of those, for any mother in any situation, is deeply traumatic. But then for her, in this culture, that also means that there is no one left to bring her what she needs just for daily necessities. And her options for taking care of herself fully in that culture are pretty limited. And that's what Jesus sees when he starts to come into the town and he sees this funeral procession come out. He sees this woman in this situation. And his heart goes out to her. He has compassion on her. So that's one thing. Understand this woman's situation. Understand what it meant to be a widow, and especially this widow who had just lost her only child, her only son. The situation that she's in. That's just it's a bad situation all around for her. And then Jesus comes up and he reaches out and he has compassion on her. He tells her to not cry, and then he reaches out and he touches the bier that the dead body is on. Basically, he touches the corpse. Now, to touch a dead body was one of the things that could make someone unclean, a Jewish person unclean. Basically, most of the things that made someone unclean had to do with symbolic representations of death or or corruption or disease or injury. And so that's why bleeding and touching a dead body and eating certain kinds of foods, these things all made you unclean. And there's most of the things that made you unclean centered around that kind of concept. They symbolically were related to something that symbolized death or injury or destruction. So Jesus reaches out, and to touch a dead body would make him unclean, and it takes, I think the ritual, the rites would take 2 weeks to be clean again after this. But Jesus reaches out and touches the dead body, and instead of making him unclean, he makes the dead body alive. So he speaks and brings it to life. Now this is tied up in a whole bunch of different stuff, a whole bunch of different concepts. But one of the concepts that it's tied up in is if you look back in the Old Testament and you look at the rituals that happened in the temple, there were some things that were designated as holy. And holy doesn't mean that it is perfect. That's kind of the concept or the idea that gets attached to holy in a lot of churches. Is if you were holy, then you were obeying the rules perfectly. You're doing what you're supposed to perfectly. But holy doesn't actually mean perfection. It means set apart. It means dedicated. And so something that was holy, that was marked as holy, that was declared holy in the temple, was something that was dedicated to a specific purpose and a sacred purpose within the temple. And so the altar was holy because it was only for making sacrifices to God. You know, when the day ended and everybody else left and the priests were the only one left behind, they didn't pop out meat and have a barbecue on the altar, right? Because the altar had a purpose. It was sacred. It was holy. It was set apart to God's use. And they didn't use those things for something totally different. They used it for the purpose that it was intended for. But something that was holy could be contaminated. Something that was holy could be made unholy or made unclean by interacting with something that wasn't clean. And so if someone brought in an unclean offering and offered it on the altar would be unclean, and they would have to purify it in order to reuse it. And so that was something that was holy. But then there were some things that were declared called most holy. And things that were most holy would have been like the Ark of the Covenant in the very center of the temple, in the Holy of Holies, the most holy place. Or there were a few other things that were declared most holy. And the characteristic of the thing that was declared most holy is that it was all related to that innermost room of the temple. It was all related to the most holy place. And the most holy place was this room that no one could enter for most of the year. It housed the Ark of the Covenant, and it was the place that God's presence was supposed to dwell on earth. It was the physical location where God's presence was there on earth. And so to enter into the Holy of Holies to enter into the most holy place was to enter into God's physical presence. And to do it unworthily, to enter into God's physical presence in an unworthy way, or when you were unclean or when you were sinful, would be death, to die. And there's several Old Testament references and moments where that comes out, that bears out. But the characteristic of the things that were marked most holy is that when they touched something that was not holy, instead of becoming unclean or tainted, they made whatever they touched holy. And so this made some problems if you had something that you brought into the temple and it was touched by something that was most holy, and it became holy because the thing that just got touched and turned into something holy, got made holy, is now fully dedicated to God and can't be used for anything else. And so if you brought in something, that was a family heirloom or something, or you just brought in something of yours, and it accidentally came in contact with something that was most holy, well, now you can't take that home and use it anymore because it belongs to God. It has been dedicated and set apart for God. It is holy. That what Jesus does here and in other places, we've seen him reach out and touch a leper to cleanse them. We've seen him now reach out and touch a dead body that would make him unholy or unclean. And instead of making him unclean, he raises the dead. And he did the same thing with the little girl. He reaches down and touches her hand. And at that point, she's a dead body. And so he touches her and speaks to her, and she, instead of making him unclean, she comes to life. And so Jesus then is acting like something that is most holy. Instead of touching something and being contaminated by what he touches, instead he decontaminates or makes holy whatever he touches. He removes the stain of death or the stain of whatever the situation was. Whatever he touches, instead of, he cleanses the leper, he raises the dead, the woman with the issue of blood, her bleeding stops, so on. People with demons, the demons are cast out. When he touches them, they become purified, holy. And so he's acting like something that is most holy. And things that are most holy are associated with the most holy place, which is the presence of God. And so this is a very subtle one, and most people don't see this one. Even a lot of ministers don't see this one. That the way that Jesus goes and touches things that would make you unclean and makes them clean instead, changes them instead of being changed himself, marks him as being like one of the things that is most holy, which means that it comes from the presence of God. And so that's a striking thing in this story and in others, that Jesus behaves as though he is something most holy, something from the most holy place. And so then Jesus, all the people see this and they are blown away. They're amazed that he is able to raise the dead, and they praise God, and they say, a great prophet has appeared among us. God has come to help his people. And so the news about Jesus begins to spread even faster. That's us caught up now for what we wanted to touch on Wednesday. Now we're looking at Matthew chapter 14, verses 1 through 36. And there's a series of 3 stories in this section. The first is the death of John the Baptist, and then there's the feeding of the 5,000, and then Jesus walking on water. And so start in Matthew 14, verse 1. We have Herod 1 and 2. We have Herod hearing reports about what Jesus is doing and the miracles that he's performing and the people following him. And his immediate thought is, John the Baptist is back. John the Baptist has come back to life. And at this point, we don't know John the Baptist is dead. We haven't been told. And so Matthew tells us that Herod hears these stories about Jesus, and he says, John the Baptist is alive. John the Baptist has returned from the dead. And then we get a flashback scene, basically. You think of it in terms of this is a flashback and explaining how John the Baptist died. And so if you remember from earlier in the semester, from a couple of weeks ago, we talked about Herod and his the animosity that ended up growing up between him and John the Baptist, because John the Baptist condemned or disapproved of his marriage and preached and taught against it and publicly said that it was wrong. And so Herod has him arrested and put in prison and wants to kill him, but is afraid to kill him because of the crowds that all believe that he is a prophet, and afraid that would cause a big backlash. And so he wants to kill him, but doesn't. He just keeps him in prison. And if you don't remember, refresher, the reason that John the Baptist objected to Herod's marriage is because Herod went for a vacation or a stay with his brother in Rome, and while he was there, he and his brother's wife started an affair. And so Herod starts sleeping with his brother's wife, and then his brother's wife ends up divorcing her husband and marrying Herod, and they come back to Herod's throne, to Jerusalem. And so Herod and Herodias, his new wife, get married and come back. And not only is Herodias his brother's wife, but she's also Herod's niece. There's a family connection back there. And so he has married his niece, who is also his brother's wife. And so for both of those reasons, the adultery and the incest, John is publicly proclaiming that this marriage is not okay. And he's objecting to this marriage publicly. And so Herodias, when she comes, she brings a daughter, her daughter from the previous marriage, from Philip. And she and her daughter come back, and they're living now with Herod. And so one day, after John the Baptist has been preaching and proclaiming and teaching that this marriage is wrong, Herodias, the wife, she has a real chip on her shoulder about him, and him objecting to their marriage, and somebody objects to her being married, it just tears her up. And so she wants John the Baptist killed. And so she tries to convince Herod to kill him, but Herod doesn't want to do it because of the opinion of the crowds and the trouble that would cause. And so she hatches up a plan and calls on her daughter and convinces her daughter to go and dance at Herod's birthday celebration. And hopes that the plan is that if she does a good enough dance, if she really catches Herod's eye and really gives him something special with the dance, Herod will offer to give her something in return, to offer to reward her with something, and she can ask for the head of John the Baptist, and that'll be the end of John the Baptist. And so the plan goes ahead. The daughter comes in and she dances for Herod, and apparently the dance is so good and so enthralling that at the end of it, he says, anything you want, whatever you ask for, I will give you. And he swears an oath to give her whatever she wants. Now, pause here for a second and let's reflect on the depth of the weirdness and wrongness in this family. Dancing can be beautiful, right? But it's not the kind of thing normally, not most of the time, that will cause a king to be willing to give up most or anything you ask for, right? To give you kind of a blank check to ask for anything that you want. Most likely then, this is not just a performance art, this is not just a dance, this is provocative. This is something on the line of a striptease. And so Herod has married his niece, who was his brother's wife, and now he is willing to overturn the kingdom to give his grandniece and stepdaughter whatever she asked for because she's just done something like a striptease for it. This family is messed up. This family is twisted, right? But Herod has made this promise now after this dance at his birthday celebration, and she asks for the head of John the Baptist on a platter. She says, give me John the Baptist's head on a platter. And Herod doesn't want to follow through on that. He doesn't want to keep his promise and give her what he asked for, but he made this oath, he took this oath in front of all of his party guests, he took it publicly, and if he doesn't follow through, it'll be an embarrassment. And so he follows through, and he goes and he gives orders for John the Baptist to be killed, beheaded, and his head brought to him, and then he gives her the head of John the Baptist on a platter, and then she goes and gives it to her mother. And so John the Baptist dies. And Jesus hears about this, and Jesus and John the Baptist have this history, right? First of all, they're cousins. Mary, Jesus' mother, and Elizabeth, John the Baptist's mother, were cousins, and so that makes Jesus and John the Baptist second cousins, at least, depending on how close the cousins were between Mary and Elizabeth, actually. We're not told that. And so Jesus and John the Baptist are family, they're related. But then also, John the Baptist has a particular role to play in Jesus' ministry, in the coming of the Messiah. He is to prepare the way, and now Jesus is seeing that this friend, this family member, and this person whose life's work is very much tied up in his, has just been killed. And so it impacts him. And so Jesus tries to pull away from the crowds and to go to somewhere and be alone, or at least with only his disciples, and process. And so he gets into a boat with his disciples and pulls away, and they begin crossing the sea and to give Jesus some time alone and to have some privacy. But the crowds are so enthused with Jesus, and they're so enthralled by what Jesus has been doing, so amazed by the miracles he's been performing and things he's been doing for them, that they go on foot around the sea, and they actually get there before he gets there. They actually get to the other side before he arrives. And so when Jesus comes out of the boat and he steps up on the shore, he sees this giant crowd gathered, and he has compassion on them. As much as he is, hurting and torn up over the death of John the Baptist, he sees this crowd with all of their myriad problems, all of their pains and their issues, and he has compassion on them, and so he goes to take care of them. He goes to give them what he can to provide for and care for them. And so he says he heals them, and heals them basically all day long. And when evening gets there, his disciples come and say, look, it's getting late. The people need to eat, and we're in the middle of nowhere. There's no food to be had right around here. Send the crowd away, send them out, and let them go to the villages around us and buy food and eat, and maybe they can come back tomorrow. And so the disciples want Jesus to send the crowds away to go and get food, and so Jesus looks back at them and says, they don't need to go away, you feed them. You give them something to eat. And the disciples, it's 12 guys, and we're told a little later in this text that there are 5,000 men plus women and children present. And so the men number 5,000, and then women and children are above and beyond that. And so there could be anywhere from 6 to 12 or 13,000 people here that we're talking about. And you got 12 guys, and it's like, that's about 1,000 people each to feed. I got a stick of gum. We don't have it. We don't have any food to give these people. And so Jesus, the disciples reply and say, look, we got 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. And John's gospel, when he's telling this story, it's John chapter 6, I think. When John's telling this story, he points out that the food, the 5 loaves of bread and the 2 fish, come from a small boy's, a young boy's lunch that he brought. And so Jesus says, well, bring me what you got. Bring them to me. And he tells the people to sit down, and he has them separate out into groups, and he lifts up the bread, and he prays and gives thanks to God for it, and then he starts to tear it, to break it. And bread, at this point, the bread was most likely a kind of flat bread. I don't know what y'all have had as far as bread, but it's probably going to be something a little bit like a pizza crust. Or if you eat any Indian food, it's like naan or roti. Or pita bread. There's lots of different flat breads in the world, but that's what this probably was, a kind of flat bread. And so 5 loaves would have been 5 pretty good sized discs of this flat bread. And so he starts taking this bread and tearing it and handing out strips to his disciples to distribute to the people. And it doesn't seem to matter how many strips he tears off. When he turns it, there's another corner to tear off. There's a little more to tear off. And so this 5 loaves of bread, and then the 2 fish, he starts pulling hunks of meat off of the fish to distribute as well. And the fish, same thing. There just always seems to be more. And the disciples keep distributing what Jesus is breaking and handing out, and eventually all 5,000 men plus all the women and children, and however many total people that is, everyone eats until they're full. Everyone eats all that they want. And then when everybody's done eating, the disciples go back out with baskets and collect, and they're all able to fill up a full basket each. And so when people see that, when the disciples see that, they are amazed. They're stunned that Jesus is able to do this. And if you look again in John's gospel at this story, he then leaves and crosses the lake again, and again the crowds follow him. And when they get to the other side and Jesus gets off the boat, the people want to make him king. They're trying to crown him and make him king immediately because they want to continue eating. At the time food was scarce. They weren't eating, most of them weren't eating their fill most days. They were eating enough to get by, but not enough to get full. And here was this man that took 5 loaves and 2 fish and fed a multitude all that they wanted. And so they want to make him king, and Jesus rejects and refuses to be crowned. But Jesus feeds the 5,000, and then Jesus gets back into the boat with his disciples, and they begin crossing back over to the other side. And so Jesus puts the disciples in the boat and has them start crossing, while he stays behind and talks to the crowd and starts to dismiss them and disperse them. And then after the crowd has kind of faded away, he goes up onto the mountain to be by himself finally and to pray. And so he prays, and he spends most of the night in prayer, and then when it's getting on towards morning, he comes down, and the text says that the disciples were already a good way into the water, but the wind was against them, and so they hadn't arrived yet. The wind was blowing against them, the water was choppy, and so they hadn't made it to the other side yet. And so Jesus just starts strolling across the water to get to them. So he just starts walking across the lake, walking across the Sea of Galilee to get to them. And as it was getting close to dawn, Jesus comes near them, and the disciples look at him and see him, and as the quiz question hinted, they were terrified and thought that he was a ghost. They see him walking across the water, and they think he's a ghost. And so they start freaking out, and Jesus immediately starts trying to calm them down and says, "Take courage, it is I, don't be afraid." And then Peter, I never know quite what Peter's thinking. He just says whatever's in his head. And sometimes it's great, and sometimes it's not, and sometimes it's just confusing. And this is one of those moments where I'm just kind of confused by his thought process. But he says, "Lord, if it's you, tell me to come down on the water. Tell me to come out to you on the water." Like, as a litmus test for whether this is Jesus, this is a bad idea. I mean, he's already heard that the figure can speak, because the figure has already spoken, and he's heard it. And so having the figure say something else to him isn't going to prove anything. If this is just a ghost, and he steps out on the water, he's going down. We're going to have a sunken fisherman. But he decides somehow, I don't get his logic, but this is the test that he gives. If it's really you, tell me to come out to you. And so Jesus says, come on. And so Peter steps over the edge, over the side of the boat, over the gunwales of the boat, and steps out on the water, and the water supports him, and he starts walking towards Jesus. And everything is going great, everything is fine, until he starts to look around and notice the intensity of the storm, or the wind that's blowing, and the waves that are up and down. And this is not a storm on the same scale as the one that they were all terrified of in the story on Wednesday when Jesus calms the storm. But it's still a heavy wind blowing, and there's lots of waves when there's heavy wind blowing. And so Jesus is, as they're walking on the water, Peter's walking to him, and then Peter starts looking around and looking at how bad the weather is. And at some point in that, his fear of the weather overcomes his trust in Jesus' ability to keep him on top of the water. And so when the fear outweighs the faith, he starts to sink. And so he is then terrified and is afraid, and he cries out, "Lord, save me. Help!" And so Jesus reaches out and grabs him by the hand and pulls him back up and says, "You have little faith, why did you doubt?" He kind of chastises him for his doubt. And they get back in the boat, and the wind dies down, and everything goes, gets calmer again. And then those who are in the boat, his disciples, worship him and say, "Truly, you are the Son of God." Now, this is an odd thing for them to do, because if you were not Jewish in this period, if you were anything other than Jewish, you were probably polytheistic, and that meant that you might worship many gods, and along with that, you might worship something that you thought had divine attributes, like a person. They said there earlier on in the semester, there was an emperor cult at the time that worshiped the emperor as being a child of God, or one of the gods, or a person invested with kind of divine attributes. And so they would worship the emperor and make sacrifices and offerings to the emperor, burn incense for the emperor. And so it was, if you were anything other than Jewish, you could do that. That might be a thing that would happen. But if you were Jewish and you believed the Old Testament, that there is only one God, the one who created everything, and that God gives commandments, that you should have no idols before him, and that you should worship nothing else, you should worship God alone. Worship belongs to God alone. Then for you to worship anything other than God is serious. And so when Jesus comes back into the boat after the walking on water and seeing Peter walk on water with him, and then Jesus rescue Peter, and then the storm or the wind dying down as soon as he gets in the boat, they're overwhelmed, and they fall down. This group of Jewish people falls down and starts to worship Jesus. This group of people that believes that worship belongs to God alone. And so when they finish their crossing over, they get to the other side, and they land at Gennesaret, or the region of the Gerasenes. It's the same term, or the same place with different terms applied to it. And if you remember the last time we saw somebody there, it was again on Wednesday, and Jesus cast the demons out of Legion. And the people were so terrified in the area, they were so unnerved by what Jesus did, that they asked him to leave. And Jesus leaves that man behind and tells him to tell about what God has done for him. Well, now Jesus has crossed back over to this region, and he's come back, and when some of the men recognize Jesus, instead of immediately asking him to leave, they immediately go and spread the news that he's there, and people start to bring their sick to him to be healed. And so that the man that Jesus had left behind, the man that had been possessed, his telling, his testimony about what happened to him, the healing that was done for him, convinces people, apparently, that changes the mood about Jesus in the area, and people trust him, and so now they're bringing droves of sick people to him to be healed. And so Jesus heals a lot of people there, and then, so that's the end of that sequence. Luke chapter 9, verses 10 through 17, we have recounting, the second telling. It's basically Luke's version of the feeding of the 5,000. There's not a big difference there, so we won't dig into it. And then looking at John, the next passage, John chapter 5, the healing at the pool. There was this pool just outside or near the sheep gate, which all of the gates into the temple complex had a name, and this one's it's the sheep gate. So the sheep gate, near this sheep gate, there's a pool. It's called the Pool of Bethesda. And there is this legend surrounding it. And if you look in your text, this is one of those moments where textual criticism that we talked about earlier, the study of the ancient manuscripts and the transmission of the manuscripts, textual criticism has led to a discovery or a decision that a particular verse was probably not in the original text. And so if you look at this passage at John chapter 5, and you look specifically, if you look at verse 4, you'll find that there is no verse 4. It's not there. There's a number for verse 4, and then there's a footnote icon. And if you go down into your footnotes and you look at the bottom of the text and you look at the footnotes, you'll see that there's a description of why that verse is not there, and then giving you the text of that verse. And so the verse has been moved to the footnotes to denote that most of the earliest manuscripts don't have this verse, and that it was probably added in later as a clarification to what's going on in the story. And that is exactly what that verse does. Verse 4, if you look at the story is, without that verse, what you got is there is a paralyzed man around this pool. In fact, there's tons of people that are sick and injured and lame around this pool. And this man is laying there and has been laying there for 38 years. And Jesus approaches him and asks, do you want to get well? And the man's reply is, sir, I have no one to help me into the water. And so when the water is stirred, someone beats me to it. Someone else is first in. And that doesn't make any sense without a clarification, right? You need to know the local legend, and that's what's in the verse 4 that's been moved to the footnotes. And the legend, the belief was that from time to time an angel would come down and stir the waters, do something that would cause the waters to get churned up and stirred up. And whoever was first into the water after that, the waters got churned up, they would be healed of whatever their sickness was. And so there were tons of people gathered around, and they were all trying to get into the pool first when the pool was disturbed. And so the pool is, all these people are surrounding it, trying to be there to be in it first when the water is stirred. And the man says, there's no one to help me in. I can't walk myself, and so I'm never the first in. And so Jesus' question, do you want to get well? The man replies, I don't have anyone to help me get into the pool. And so Jesus just skips the pool. However much truth there was in that local legend, that understanding, Jesus just skips all of that and says, get up and take your mat and walk. And so the man gets up, takes up his mat, and finds that he's healed and he can walk. And so he begins walking. And as he walks out, as he leaves, Jesus has melted into the crowd, and so he doesn't know for sure that it's Jesus that's healed him. He doesn't really know who it was that told him to get up and take his mat and walk. But he gets up and he takes his mat and he begins to walk out. And as he's walking out, some of the Pharisees, the religious leaders, see him, and they see him carrying the mat, and they start getting on to him for carrying his mat because it's the Sabbath day. And he's doing work by carrying his mat. And so they get onto him for it, and he says, the man that healed me told me to pick up my mat and take it. And so I'm picking up my mat and taking it. And so they say, well, who healed you? Who told you to do this? And I don't know. A few days later, Jesus comes and talks to him again in the temple, finds him there and talks to him. And now he knows that it's Jesus, and so he goes and tells the Pharisees who it was that healed him. And so the Pharisees and the religious leaders start going after Jesus for healing on the Sabbath day again. And Jesus replies and says, my Father is always at his work to this very day, and I too am working. And we're running out of time, so I'm not going to go into depth on that. But basically, the Pharisees hear this as Jesus claiming to be the Son of God and therefore to be equal with God. It says, for this reason they tried all the more to kill him. Not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was calling God his own Father and making himself equal with God. And then Jesus replies and gives them another answer, and he says, very truly I tell you, the Son can do nothing by himself. He can only do what he sees his Father doing, because whatever the Father does, the Son also does. Now, at this point, we're past what I asked you guys to read for the day. One of the things that John does frequently is he'll show Jesus performing a miracle, and then there will be some kind of fallout from that miracle, and Jesus will use the consequences of that miracle as an opportunity to teach or to say something about himself or to teach people. And that's what's happening here. Jesus has healed this man on the Sabbath, and as a result of him healing this man on the Sabbath, it stirred up the Pharisees, and they're confronting Jesus now. And so now he's telling the Pharisees and teaching his disciples in the process something about who he is and why he does what he does. And so he ends this section, he says, very truly I tell you, the Son can do nothing by himself. He can do only what he sees his Father doing, because whatever the Father does, the Son also does. And this brings up, or kind of informs us a little bit about why Jesus does some things the way that he does them. Why does he do some miracles and not others? For example, if you remember back to the temptation story, when Satan is tempting Jesus, the first of the temptations, he tells him to take the stones and turn them into bread. Because Jesus had been fasting for a long time and was very hungry. And so Satan says, the tempter says, take these stones and turn them into bread. And Jesus refuses. He says, man does not live by bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God. And so he refuses to turn the stones into bread. And yet, we've just seen him turn a little bread into a lot of bread. And so he refuses to make miraculous bread during the temptation, but he has no problem making miraculous bread a little later. What's the difference? And there's a couple of different possibilities, but this text gives us an idea that could explain some of it, that could explain maybe why Jesus does one thing but not another. The Son does nothing by himself, but only what he sees the Father doing. The idea is that the things that Jesus does as miracles are really just Jesus doing in a small and visible way, small and local way, on a small scale, what God is doing, what the Father is doing all the time on a large scale. Right? And so, for example, with the feeding of the 5,000, Jesus took bread and broke it and turned a little bit of bread into a whole lot of bread, and a little bit of fish into a whole lot of fish. Well, any of you bakers, any of you ever bake bread? Do you know the basic ingredients in bread dough? Basically flour, which is ground up grain, and then water and usually a fat, oil or butter or something like that. And then if you want the bread to rise, you add a leavening agent like yeast or baking soda or baking powder, something that will make carbon dioxide bubbles in it and cause it to rise up. And so that's it. That's bread. And then people add other things to make it taste different, and there are lots of different styles depending on the kind of grain you use and so on. But that's bread. It's grain ground up as flour, water, fat, and a leavening agent if you want it to rise. And so basically when Jesus takes bread and holds it up and breaks it, starts breaking it, he's holding up something that is primarily grain. And where does grain come from? Other grain, right? Grain is itself a seed, and when you drop that seed, you plant it in the ground, it grows up, it produces a plant that makes a whole lot more grain. And so every year, every time a crop comes in, God, through the processes of nature, has taken a little bit of grain and turned it into a whole lot of grain. And so Jesus, when he performs the miracle, he takes a little bit of grain, a little bit of bread, and breaks it and turns it into a whole lot of bread. The only difference is he's doing it small and immediately so that you can see it. Same thing with the fish. Where do fish come from? Other fish. And fish multiply fast. And so why does Jesus do it this way? Why does he make this fish this way? That's what God is doing all the time. And so he breaks it and he makes a little fish into a lot of fish. The turning of the water into wine. Why does he turn water into wine? Well, every year, God causes grapevines to take up water from the soil and all the other nutrients and to turn that into grape juice, which is then turned into wine. Jesus uses nasty, funky foot water with all kinds of mud and muck and gunk and even poop fertilizer in the bottom of it, and water, and turns that into wine. It's still imitating what God does on the larger scale, just smaller where you can see it. Healings. The body heals itself because that's how God made us. Jesus just does it quick, where we can see it. And so that's an indication that why does Jesus do some things and not others? One possibility is that he's imitating the Father's style. Now, so that I know that we're after time, it's 1:51. I want to give you a couple of these things I've written on the board so that we're not too far behind for next time. One is, we've noticed that Jesus starts with very truly or truly I tell you very frequently. Like when he's saying something, he'll very, very frequently start with those words. In Greek, that phrase, very truly or truly I tell you, is amen. And it's, sometimes he'll do it for emphasis and say amen, amen, and say amen twice. You may recognize that word from being what we close a prayer with at church. That is the way it gets used. But amen means truly, and it's an expression of affirmation or agreement. And so the reason we say that at the end of prayers in church is because when we say amen at the end of a prayer in church, what we're saying is this is the entire congregation's prayer, not just the pastors or the worship leaders. It makes it the whole church's prayer. And we'll get into the miracles of the old creation and new creation on Wednesday, I suppose. So, thank y'all. We'll see you here on Monday for the exam. If you have any questions about it or anything else, come and see me now.